Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and I am coming to you from another day inside this new reality we've stumbled into. I'm growing as sick of it as all the rest of you, but hopefully these slight signs of improvement are going to be long-lasting, and we are moving step by step closer to ribbons and candy floss. I myself, from both a personal and professional standpoint, am very happy to see that the film industry is trending in that direction, with a monster blockbuster like Godzilla vs. Kong being released. And today on the show, I have a whole slate of pretty awesome-looking films that all look incredibly appealing for different reasons and deal with a good amount of symbolism in them. Which, of course, is always nice when the story is a little bit more than just a narrative and there is a true message behind the film. Starting off in this segment, I'm going to be talking about the upcoming film Voyagers, which has a tremendous cast and tells the story of a group of young people that have been bred in isolation and are on a space mission to find an inhabitable planet where they can restart humanity as more of a master race. There appears to be a whole lot of symbolism in this one, and the plot looks very intriguing, so I'm looking forward to talking about it. After that, I will be talking about the film Amundsen, The Greatest Expedition, which follows the tale of a man who is trying to become the first person to successfully lead an expedition to the North Pole. Utterly consumed by achieving his goal, it appears he is willing to sacrifice almost anything to reach his destination. So if you're a fan of the big epic adventure genre, stick around for that in our second segment. And if you are a fan of the psychotic horror thriller genre, you're going to want to stick around until our third segment, as I'm going to be taking a look at the film Every Breath You Take, the new film that stars Casey Affleck as a psychiatrist that has a patient of his commit suicide, and while attempting to help her grieving brother, his life is completely thrown into utter turmoil. That film appears to be an incredibly emotional thrill ride, so if you are drawn to any of the three reasons people seek out horror films that I covered in my last episode, be sure to check out Every Breath You Take. And if you are a box office nerd much like myself, you're going to want to stick around until the end of the show, where I take a look at the month of April at the box office. While doing my research, I found a few surprising discoveries, and took a look as to why the month of April performs the way it does at the box office. So, if you are curious to learn more about that topic, be sure to stick around until the end of the show. But we are going to start off the show, as we do each episode, by taking a look at a film from the book, 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. And to all my listeners, I have to make the professional recommendation that you wait until you are 18 to see this film, because I'm going to be talking about the Paul Thomas Anderson film, Boogie Nights. And for those who are unaware, this 1979 classic takes a look and dramatizes the adult film industry of the 1970s. It takes a look at that lifestyle, as well as the type of human beings that are drawn into that industry, while showing you the immense highs that they can reach and the incredible lows that they sink to. Subject matter aside, this film is really just an incredibly well-made film that shows you how characters can at one moment be displaying the most positive and carefree emotions, and then on a dime they can turn to being miserable, despondent, and looking for answers. It is really a credit to the director, Paul Thomas Anderson, that he's able to accurately portray both sides of this coin and make a film that can shift so suddenly from fun in the sun and then all of a sudden be really, really dark. And it is really a credit to the cast in this film that they are able to portray such a wide range of emotions. And it shouldn't be that surprising given the level of talent in this cast. This is probably the film that launched Mark Wahlberg into being a household name. In this, he plays adult film star by the name of Dirk Diggler, and he makes this incredible transformation as a starry-eyed youth with his head in the clouds and delusions of grandeur into a really hardened individual who has seen a lot of negative things. But he is not the only one who turns in an incredible performance. The legendary Julianne Moore is also in the film. She plays a woman in the industry who is constantly haunted by the fact that she no longer has custody of her son. And in a very perverse character trait, she treats her co-stars in the industry as a sort of substitute for her estranged son, which includes Mark Wahlberg's character, in addition to Heather Graham's character of Roller Girl, who is an adult entertainer with the gimmick of always wearing rollerblades. But her character isn't just played for comic relief. Her character really shows the vulnerability that someone in the adult industry can still embody. So the main cast turns in incredible performances with supporting players like William H. Macy, John C. Reilly, and the late Philip Seymour Hoffman making their contributions to the film as well. But probably no one made more of a contribution to this film than the late Burt Reynolds, who actually garnered an Academy Award nomination for his performance in Boogie Nights, which is all the more ironic because he hated his participation in the film. But despite all that, it doesn't take away the fact that Boogie Nights is a classic film, and I do recommend to anyone who has not seen it to check it out. Once again, with my professional opinion being, to all those underage, wait until you are 18 to see the film. And for anyone curious as to how you can watch this film, it is available via streaming on HBO Max. So there you have it, this week's installment from the film of 1001 movies you must see before you die, Boogie Nights. But moving away from films of the past, let's get into some new releases that are coming out, the first of which we will be talking about on this podcast is the new film Voyagers. This film looks very intriguing, and I think it will really be the sleeper hit of the season. Though, admittedly, it is a little tough to call it a sleeper hit when you take a look at the fantastic cast that is involved in this picture, which I will get into a little bit later in the segment, but I do want to give a quick synopsis of the film. The movie starts out with this idea that there needs to be a space mission to find an inhabitable planet so that the human race can survive after apparently doing cataclysmic to the planet Earth. The journey of this space voyage will apparently take 86 years, and the crew of this ship will essentially be made out of designer babies that were grown in test tubes. And while aboard the ship, they are going to be bred for pretty much the purpose of being super intelligent as well as compliant. The main way this is achieved is by them being essentially drugged every single day. They have to take a blue concoction every morning until one of them discovers that it is suppressing their emotions, most notably pleasure. And once this is discovered, a few of them decide to stop taking the blue cocktail they have to take. This results in them feeling emotions for pretty much the first time in their life. Now, with their original intention to feel pleasure, it's a bit of a Pandora's box situation, where when you let out one of them, you let out all of them. So after the positive initial returns of being able to feel pleasure, these crew members go on to feel the more negative emotions that a human being is capable of feeling. So there is a lot to unpack with the premise of this film, as well as looking into what the deeper symbolism could be. But I feel at least certain aspects are pretty obvious to deconstruct and find out what the filmmakers were trying to say about things. First off, the children in this film that will grow up to be the crew of the ship are described as a bridge between what humanity used to be and what it is going to be. And I believe that's a not-so-subtle allegory to millennials being referred to as the information generation. With the advent of the internet, and the major leaps that have been made in technology occurring during their lifespan, this generation of human beings has seen a major paradigm shift when it comes to how humanity functions, yet many of them can still remember the old ways of how things were done. So much like how that real-life generation is a link between the past and the future when it comes to how society functions, this generation in the movie Voyagers is supposed to be the same thing, only they are supposed to reinvent humanity as a hyper-intelligent, obedient civilization. One of the other not-so-subtle metaphors that I think the filmmakers are trying to drive home is the blue drink that these kids have to take every morning. It is presented to them as something that will provide them with plenty of nutrients and make them more productive, but one of the hidden side effects of this drink is that it completely suppresses their emotions. It really doesn't take a genius to decipher what the filmmakers are trying to relay with that imagery. When it comes to making kids compliant, there have been medications out there for decades that parents have turned to when they are seemingly out of options on how to rein in their child's wild behavior, and you can even go beyond how they're used for children. More and more in our society, people are turning to prescription drugs to deal with issues that they have because they are unable to control their emotions or adequately cope with the struggles they face in their lives. Now, when it comes to how this is portrayed in the film with the blue drink, I don't know how familiar people are with prescription drugs, but blue is often the color of stimulants, which are often prescribed to children with learning deficits. And the drug in particular that's probably the most well-known and widely prescribed is Adderall. And I understand that the use of these prescription drugs are meant for parents to be helping their kids to make sure they don't fall behind in academics. And I can see the merit in certain prescription drugs that help kids focus, like Ritalin and Concerta, but Adderall is essentially just a low-grade form of meth. You can't really argue with its results, but I'm sure that I'm not the only person who has worked with someone who has an Adderall prescription well beyond their academic years, and the use of Adderall in adults is a bit creepy. In my own personal experience, people that have used the drug for their work tend to be impulsive, lack compassion, and are not really in touch with reality. They seem to see this world through a very distorted point of view, and when it comes down to it, it may help you be more productive, but at what cost? And I'm sure that the film Voyagers is going to take a look at that when certain members of the crew decide to stop taking the blue substance. I should also take this time to mention the fact that this film is written and directed by the director of the film Limitless, and if that entire movie wasn't a metaphor for Adderall, I don't know what is. But I'm sure that Neil Berger's latest film is going to be as immersive and thought-provoking as Limitless was. And that should not be difficult given the cast he has to work with, including the veteran Colin Farrell, who has really had a career renaissance as of late with his performances in films such as Lobster, in addition to big box office franchise movies like Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. He leads a crop of young actors in this film, including Ty Sheridan, who most people will probably know from his performances in Ready Player One, and as Cyclops in the recent X-Men movies. Additionally, Lily Rose Depp is in the film, and if good acting is genetic, then she should be able to turn in an incredible performance, as she is the daughter of Johnny Depp. Fionn Whitehead is also in the film, and most people will remember him from his performance in the Christopher Nolan film Dunkirk. And Isaac Hempstead Wright is also in the film, who, of course, played Bran in HBO's Game of Thrones. So the film Voyagers has an incredibly talented young cast, in addition to an outstanding director, and the story itself seems as though it will touch on a lot of contemporary issues, while providing a very entertaining story. So for everyone interested in checking out the movie Voyagers, it'll be available nationwide in theaters starting Friday, April 9th. So I encourage everyone to check out the film Voyagers, but right now on the GSMC Movie Podcast, we are going to be taking a quick break, but be sure to stick around. As in our next segment, we are going to be getting into the film Amundsen, The Greatest Expedition, the film that tells the story of a man who is obsessed with completing his goal of reaching the North Pole, and appears willing to sacrifice anything in order to accomplish that goal. So if you are a fan of the fantastical adventure type movie, you're definitely going to want to stick around to hear what I have to say about that. Also, you'll want to stick around to hear about the new film, Every Breath You Take, which is a psychological thriller starring Casey Affleck as a psychiatrist who has a patient commit suicide, and while attempting to help her grieving brother, sees his own life fall into disarray. So we have a lot of compelling films yet to talk about on the GSMC Movie Podcast. And be sure to stick around until the very last segment of the show, as I'm going to be taking a look at the month of April at the box office. Traditionally one of the lowest performing months on the box office calendar. I take a look as to why that is, despite the fact it has been the month certain films like Avengers Endgame, Avengers Infinity Wars, and The Matrix have all made their debut in. April just seems to be one of those months that underperforms at the box office. So stick around. We have all that and more coming up on the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
And welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and on my last segment, I just finished talking about the new film Voyagers, the film about a space voyage that is led by Colin Farrell's character, and his crew is made up of hyper-intelligent children who are bred to be super smart as well as obedient, and they are meant to find an inhabitable planet in order to essentially start the human race anew. While on this voyage, however, they discover that the blue supplement they take each morning is essentially suppressing their emotions, most notably pleasure, and a few of them decide to no longer take the supplement. This has a bit of a Pandora's box effect. After initially experiencing the enjoyable aspects of having their emotions untethered, they inevitably experience the negative aspects of that. Combine all this with the fact that they are all confined to a ship hurtling through space, and you have a lot of combustible elements on your hands. To give my 2 cents, I think this film is going to be really great. From the plot to the acting, as I mentioned earlier, it stars Colin Farrell. In addition to him, young stars like Ty Sheridan and Lily Rose Depp will be making their contributions to the film Voyagers, so be sure to check it out. The film is set for release Friday, April 9th, and will be in theaters nationwide. So if you are going to a theater, be sure to be safe, but I highly recommend, if you're going to see a film, see Voyagers. And to give a little preview of what will be coming up in the show, later on I will be talking about the film Every Breath You Take with Casey Affleck, who plays a psychiatrist who had one of his patients commit suicide and is now having to deal with her psychotic brother. Also, be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as I will be diving into the month of April and how it usually performs at the box office. My curiosity of this topic was piqued just because so many theaters are reopening, and movies are really getting the first opportunity in over a year to make box office paydays. So I thought I would dive a little bit deeper into April by the numbers, and I will be using numbers from boxofficemojo.com and tracking between the years 1979 and 2019. mostly because in 1979, that's when real accurate records of cinema releases started being kept, and 2019 is my cutoff because I really don't think it's fair to include months that had to cope with the pandemic. So be sure to stick around till the very end of the show, as I'll be diving into April at the box office. But in this segment, I'm going to be talking about Amundsen, The Greatest Expedition, and this is a film detailing the journey of Roald Amundsen and his crew as they attempted to be the first team to reach the South Pole. There seem to be a whole ton of movies coming out lately that are based on true events, and this is one that is based during the time which is now known as the historic age of Antarctic exploration. To give a quick synopsis of the film before I dive into the real-life events that inspired them. The film is based around the British actually announcing that they're going to make an exploration towards the South Pole. So the main character of this film and the real-life Roald Amundsen decided to make a race out of it and see who could reach the South Pole first. Now, given that this film is based on true events, the whole plot can be spoiled by just doing a quick Google search, but this film is really more about the stunning visuals, given that this movie was filmed in locations such as Iceland as well as Norway. And the true message of this film is really one about determination and achieving your goals. Now, in real life, most of us are not going to be faced with the goal of discovering places like the Northwest Passage or the South Pole as Amundsen was, nor will many of us have to face the treacherous conditions of sub-zero temperatures as well as driving blizzards, but it's all relative when it comes to being presented with a task and seeing it through to the end. So this film, Amundsen, The Greatest Expedition, will really be focused around the determination and dedication that is required when you're setting out to achieve a goal of any kind. So whether that's an everyday task that we normal people have to face, or in his case, if that means discovering the South Pole for the first time. And with the benefit of this being a movie based on true events, we can expound a little bit on the story being told. And in this case, the main character, Roald Amundsen. To give a little background on his life, he was born in Norway on July 16th, 1872. And he was born to a family of ship owners. And the ultimate irony of what he ended up doing with his life, his mother always wanted him to be a doctor. And this was the path that he was set on early in his life. But when his mother died while he was attending university, he promptly quit for life at sea. I guess him and his mother weren't that close. But turning his back on a life of medicine probably wasn't the worst decision of his life, because soon after he began his career as an explorer and would begin making expeditions to the North and South Pole. And while this film, The Greatest Expedition, is about his journey to the South Pole, he was also the first man to successfully lead an expedition across the Northwest Passage, which for those who don't know is the icy tundra in the north of Canada. He was the first to lead an expedition from the Atlantic to the Pacific, so you can kind of think of him as Canada's Lewis and Clark. But during Amundsen's many expeditions, he would cross paths with other famous explorers, most notably probably Frederick Cook, who was the man who claimed to have been the first to discover the North Pole. Their paths crossed during an expedition to the Antarctic, where the ship they were on actually got sealed off from the open sea by an ice formation. And Amundsen credits Cook for really saving the crew that was ill-prepared for this expedition. And Cook was able to hunt and provide the crew with fresh meat that helped them stave off scurvy. So thankfully for Amundsen, Cook was on that expedition and not only saved his life, but the lives of the rest of the crew. Because his life was saved, he was then able to lead that expedition successfully across the Northwest Passage. And once he successfully led that expedition, he really focused his career on traveling to both the poles of the Earth. He was originally planning an expedition to the North Pole in 1909, but he was having trouble funding the expedition, and he also found out that Frederick Cook, who we referenced earlier, and explorer Robert Peary had both reached the North Pole through different expeditions. So, in the ultimate way of turning a negative into a positive, he decided to shift his focus to planning an expedition to reach the South Pole. However, he really wasn't that upfront with his intentions to plan an expedition to the South Pole. His financiers, as well as other members of his crew, had not been told that he was shifting his focus to that. I'm sure much of this will be covered in the film, and these events are really going to drive the plot. But just imagine, it is the early 1900s, you are an explorer, and there are still uncharted places in the world left to explore. You are planning an expedition, you're raising funds for it, and you are not really telling people what your true intentions are. Yet you are just driven by this goal to be the first to discover a place. You missed out on being the first to discover the North Pole. You hear that there's going to be another expedition trying to reach the South Pole. And the competitive fire in you is just telling you that you can't allow someone else to achieve this goal that you have set out for yourself. Now, I won't go into any further details on the expedition he undertakes, as the movie is going to cover all of that, and I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. For those of you who are going into the film, I want you to go in fresh and uncorrupted. But beyond this expedition, Amundsen really led a very interesting life. I will give the slight spoiler that he does survive his expedition to the South Pole, and after that he would once again direct his focus to reaching the North Pole. He would naturally attempt to do this in the way he was familiar with, by sea, by trying to find a way through the Northwest Passage to reach the North Pole, but ultimately he became an innovator in aerial exploration. He would successfully reach the North Pole despite everyone thinking him and his crew had been lost due to them losing all radio contact, but they would return triumphantly, having reached the North Pole. And here is where one of the most ironic and interesting facts about this man's life comes into effect. Prior to him reaching the North Pole, there had been 3 expeditions that successfully claimed reaching the destination first. We mentioned 2 of them, Frederick Cook and Robert Peary, as well as explorer Richard Byrd, claiming to have reached the North Pole just days before Amundsen and his crew. But all of these claims are surrounded by controversy, with them all being disputed by inaccurate record keeping or just flat out fabrication. So this man Amundsen, who had to shift his priorities towards being the first man to reach the South Pole, may have actually been the first man to reach the North Pole. And I'm not sure if that aspect of his life is going to be included in the film, but I think that's a pretty great metaphor for determination. There are always going to be setbacks, there are always going to be things that don't go according to plan, but you have to make do with what you got. And in the case of this story, literally forge ahead, because things may not always turn out as you want. For instance, Amundsen is not recognized as the first man to have reached the North Pole, but that did not stop him from having an incredibly illustrious career, to the point where almost 100 years after his death, he is having a movie made about his life's work. And I mentioned earlier that this is just one in the long string of movies that are being made right now that are based on true stories. I don't know if, the film industry in general is just gotten to the point where if they come up with a fictional story, it doesn't captivate audiences the same way as films based off true events do. But it really feels like there's been this movement to make films based off of truly remarkable people that accomplished remarkable things. And again, there is that old saying that the truth is stranger than fiction. But in this case, it may be that the fantastical achievements that have been made in human history are better than anything that can come from the mind of a Hollywood screenwriter. Now, this, of course, is a dramatization, and they have done a lot to change the character in the film from the real-life Amundsen. While the one in real life, by all accounts, was a very noble individual, the one in the film has the reputation of being a real fanatic who is willing to sacrifice anything and essentially anyone to achieve his goals. And I really wonder if that is the filmmaker's way of adopting a character that is trying to achieve something great and give him that fanatical personality where he's willing to win at all costs. No matter what he has to do, he's willing to do it, in the vein of someone like Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, no matter if that means doing something unethical or even doing something illegal. So whatever personality traits they give to Roald Amundsen, I hope they just do his life works justice, because he was a man who really accomplished a plethora of notable things. And this film is really going to be driven by his character's journey, in addition to the amazing visuals that will be presented on the screen. Like I said, this movie was filmed in locations such as Norway and Iceland, both of which house incredible landscapes and are really something out of a fairy tale. So the mere visuals that are presented on screen will be something to behold. And despite me not being very familiar with most of the main cast, I'm sure the acting will be up to snuff. I do have a general rule on this show, and that is that European actors are traditionally better than their American counterparts. But probably the most notable actor in this film is Catherine Waterson, who plays Tina Goldstein in the Fantastic Beasts films. Her fellow cast members include Paul Sevier Hagen. I really hope I'm pronouncing that name right, but he is playing the titular Amundsen. Also joining him in this film is Christian Rubeck, as well as Trond Espen Sim, who is probably best known for being in the remake of The Thing from 2011. So while I'm not that familiar with the cast, I really think this film is going to be a good one and will largely be a metaphor for maintaining your determination in the face of adversity. And for all those listening who are interested in seeing the film, it does have a little bit of a unique release story, having been released all the way back in 2019. But solely within the country of Norway. It is now making its way to American theaters, and it is set for release April 2nd. So by the time you are listening to this podcast, you will be able to see it, so be sure to check out Amundsen, The Greatest Expedition. Right now, however, I'm going to take a quick break on the GSMC Movie Podcast, but be sure to stick around because coming up, I will be talking about the film Every Breath You Take, the new psychological thriller starring Casey Affleck as a psychiatrist who unfortunately has one of his patients commit suicide while on his watch. Not only is he going to have to cope with the emotional fallout of that event, but he is also going to have to deal with the brother of the patient, who essentially holds him responsible and is out to make his life a living hell. So be sure to stick around if you're curious about that film. Also, I will be continuing with the GSMC Movie Podcast news segment, where I talk about news around the film industry. I have a lot to talk about on this report, as new trailers dropped, including one for Black Widow, as well as Space Jam: A New Legacy. So there's a whole bunch of information to dive into there. And be sure to stick around until the end of the show, as I'm going to be diving into April at the box office. Now that theaters are opening up and films are actually getting the opportunity to make box office money, it got me curious as to how April usually performs at the box office and what type of films are released in the month of April. I made a couple cool discoveries, so you're not going to want to miss it. So do not go anywhere. The GSMC Movie Podcast will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and my last segment, I just finished talking about the film Amundsen, The Greatest Expedition, which details the real-life true story of a man's expedition to the South Pole, and how he is seemingly willing to risk everything in order to be the first one to make it there. In the long line of films coming out right now that are based on true events, this one seems to be the more unbelievable, fantastical adventure type film. So, if you are interested in seeing a film with stunning visuals and a group of characters absolutely determined to achieve the goals they have set out for themselves, be sure to check out Amundsen, The Greatest Expedition. Shifting gears a little in this segment, I'm going to be talking about the new film, Every Breath You Take, the psychological thriller starring Casey Affleck, where he plays a psychiatrist that has one of his patients commit suicide, and he then has to deal with the repercussions of her grieving brother who cannot accept that she is gone. So, I will be talking about Every Breath You Take a little later on in this segment. But first, as we are coming out of halftime, it is time for the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report. And there is quite a bit of news to go over, from new trailers dropping, revealing more information about anticipated films, to speculation on which actors are going to play major characters in future films, and another set of film delays. So, let's get into it. And since I just mentioned films being delayed, I'll start off with that topic. The Tom Holland movie Uncharted has been delayed 1 week, and will now be debuting in theaters February 18th of 2022. This is a very small delay, but given that the fans of this film have been waiting since June of 2016 for this movie, that being when it was originally slated for release, from there it was pushed back to June of 2017, and that was just the start of the many delays it would face. From there it would be delayed until December of 2020, then to March of 2021, then it was pushed all the way back to be released in October of 2021, but then it was moved up to be released in July of 2021 before the studio finally settled on February of 2022. It is still set to be released in February of 2022, even if it is a week later than originally anticipated. Let's just hope this time it actually makes its way to theaters. Uncharted is the much anticipated video game adaptation starring Tom Holland, so its many fans can't wait for it to be released. Moving on to other film industry news, it appears that DC is once again trying to build an extended cinematic universe in response to the release of Justice League, Zack Snyder's cut. This strategy was tipped off by Warner Brothers canceling 2 upcoming planned DC films, one titled New Gods, the other would have been an Aquaman spin-off called The Trench. And the rationale for binning these projects was that they would not fit narratively along with the rest of the DC EU movies. They are still planning to move forward with films such as the Black Adam film starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, as well as the sequel to Shazam. There are also talks of an Aquaman sequel and a standalone Flash movie starring Ezra Miller. So while the studio is juggling a lot, it is really interesting to see just how fluid a process movie making is nowadays, and how an industry that was really built on having meticulous details planned out months and even years in advance is now seemingly making snap decisions that have multi-million-dollar implications attached to them. It just goes to show you that because of the many different ways audience members can make their voices heard and interact with studios, those studios can in turn take that feedback and make rather snap decisions off of it. Who's to say if that's a positive or a negative, but I'm sure that we will see more of it in the years to come. Something that is unclear on whether we'll see it in the years to come, but it's a fun idea that was recently thrown out there, and that is the idea of Daisy Ridley joining the MCU as Spider-Woman. The actress in a recent interview spoke about possibly bringing the Marvel character to the big screen, and while at this point it is merely speculation, but who knows, Daisy Ridley obviously has a good relationship with Disney, and the MCU seems destined to expand into infinity given the amount of intellectual property they have to work with. Speaking of the MCU, a new trailer for the upcoming Black Widow film just dropped. It reveals a little bit more about the backstory of Scarlett Johansson's character, Natasha Romanoff, and the life she led before she became an Avenger. And this trailer also seemed to reveal the villain that she'll be going against in the film. Now, I'm sure comic book fans could tell me exactly who this character is, but I'll just let those listening know that he had a Power Rangers type helmet and carries a sword. That aside, the film seems to have a few amazing action sequences, so all the more reason to be excited for its July 9th release date. Coincidentally, a film that is set for release 1 week after Black Widow also had a new trailer drop, and that is Space Jam: A New Legacy, and it really gave us an insight into what the plot is going to be. As most people know, Space Jam: A New Legacy will star LeBron James, and apparently the synopsis for the film is going to be his son gets sucked into the serververse, as it's termed, and in order to get him back, he is going to have to, once again, team up with the Looney Tunes to take on what is called the Goon Squad in this film. The internet is already having a ton of fun with this trailer, given that there is a clip in the trailer where LeBron is writing his dream roster on a blackboard, and he has names like the Iron Giant, Gandalf, and Superman on it, but he is going to have to make do with the Looney Tune characters. And some other details that were revealed during the trailer is that Zendaya has been cast as Lola Bunny, and there is a sequence in this film that reenacts the legendary photo of Dwayne Wade and LeBron James connecting on an alley-oop. So not only does this film appear to be a fun follow-up to the original, it also appears to be a vehicle in which Warner Brothers can pretty much show off every intellectual property they have. There apparently is a Game of Thrones planet in the serververse, and characters like King Kong and even the Flintstones make cameo appearances in this film. So this film is clearly anticipated due to it being a follow-up to the original Space Jam, but it also just seems like it's going to be a whole bunch of fun for audiences of all ages. And I think that will pretty much do it for the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report. But for anyone looking to keep up with the latest industry news, be sure to follow us on our social media pages, Twitter and Instagram. Twitter is GSMC_movies, and Instagram is GSMC_movie. So to all the listeners out there, I'd love to interact with you on those platforms, so be sure to give us a follow. But right now, let's get back to the name of the game, and that is talking about the newest releases and what movies are worth seeing. The next one I will be talking about is the new film, Every Breath You Take, which stars Casey Affleck as a psychiatrist who has a patient who commits suicide. Deeply troubled by this loss, his character reaches out to his dead patient's brother in an attempt to help them both come to grips with the loss, but this ends up causing even more trouble. This film seems to be built around a lot of tension, suspense, and unhinged characters, so if you're drawn to horror films for the 3 reasons I elaborated on last episode, which are tension, which is the desire to see the mystery resolved, and you enjoy the ride you are taken on as an audience member to get to that point, or the realism of a story, which again is when there are elements in a fictional story that you can relate to your own personal life. So I guess anyone who has seen a psychiatrist or God forbid had a family member commit suicide could relate to this film, or you could enjoy it for the exact opposite reason of that, which is the unrealism. And that is when you find a story so unrelatable, you are just enjoying the unrealistic aspects of it. So for this film, Every Breath You Take, I sure hope you are seeking it out for the reason of tension or looking for the unrealism aspects of the movie. But whatever your reasons for watching a movie are, I really think that Every Breath You Take has a lot to offer, from the acting to the ambiguity of the story being told. The cinematography looks amazing, and I think there's a little more than meets the eye with what is presented to us as the main plot. In the trailer, we are told one thing, but just with a film like this, I think there's going to be a twist that reveals a lot more than what was originally presented to us. In the trailer, it was clearly noted that they did not find a suicide note, so there is reason to believe that there was foul play with that character's death to begin with. Casey Affleck's character appears to have a strained marriage, so who really knows what his character's wife's motivation is? And this brother character, played by Sam Cloughlin, appears to be unhinged in his own right, so who's to say what his motivation is and what more there is to his character? So there are a ton of wild card factors in the film Every Breath You Take, and that's pretty much the beauty of horror thriller films. While the filmmakers do drop hints and foreshadowing within the film, the main goal of these pictures is to keep the audience on the edge of their seat, constantly guessing at what is going to happen next. And this film has set up a very strange dynamic. As most people are aware, there are boundaries between patients and doctors, so as to not create a conflict of interest. And even though the brother played by Sam Cloughlin isn't a patient, he's the brother of a patient. And this film has set it up that he is literally going to be moving in with the doctor who was treating his sister that just committed suicide. And the reasons as to how he ends up moving in with them are a little convoluted, but the bottom line is he ends up living with the family. Not only that, but he essentially blames Casey Affleck's character for his sister's death. So the setup for this movie is there's an unhinged person living with the family of the psychiatrist of his sister who committed suicide, and he is motivated to essentially make that psychiatrist's life a living hell. So this film is definitely asking you to suspend your disbelief a lot when it comes to the plot, but hopefully the great acting in it will compensate for that. Like I said earlier, Casey Affleck is the lead, and he has really proven his worth in dramatic roles in recent years, especially in Manchester by the Sea, so I am sure that he will turn in an excellent performance. I also mentioned that Sam Cloughlin is in the film, and he does a great job when he's portraying a villain. He's been in films like Snow White and the Huntsman, as well as The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and he was also on the hit show Peaky Blinders as Oswald Mosley. And he is really going to get an opportunity in this film to shine as someone who is unhinged and really deliver a performance with a whole lot of range to it. Also in the film is the lovely Michelle Monaghan, who is reuniting with Casey Affleck, having previously collaborated with him on the 2007 film Gone Baby Gone, which of course was directed by Casey's brother Ben. And I know I have a rule of not getting on actors for taking work where they can get it, but I'm glad that she's in a film like this as opposed to something like one of her more recent projects, Pixels. I understand you have to take the money where you can get it, but my God, was that film awful. But back to Every Breath You Take. Some other actors that are a little bit lesser known making up the cast are Veronica Ferris, who has been in the Academy Award nominated film Shkatonk. I'm sorry, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, and I am not familiar with the film whatsoever, but hopefully she is a good actress and will contribute a good performance to the film Every Breath You Take. Another lesser-known actress in this film is India Esley, who is probably best known for her role on the show The Secret Life of an American Teenager. So in fairness to her, she does have a lot of experience as an actress, despite her young age. And I'm sure she will also have a lot to contribute to this film, Every Breath You Take, which I should probably mention is directed by Von Steen, who is probably best known for directing the Margaret Robbie film, The Terminal. That film was also structured as a mystery thriller, so the director obviously has experience in that arena. So it will be interesting to see how they build on that reputation in this film. And this film could have been a very different one than the one we are getting now. All the way back in 2012, this film was working under the title You Belong to Me and was set to have Rob Reiner in the director's chair. Yes, the man who directed When Harry Met Sally. It also at one point had Harrison Ford and Zac Efron attached to the project, so whatever that film was going to be sounds pretty interesting, but it is definitely different than the one that we have now. But this version does seem like it has a lot of compelling elements to it. So for anyone interested in seeing Every Breath You Take, it has already been released to limited theaters, and it is available via video on demand. So for anyone looking for a psychological thriller, be sure to check it out. I, however, am going to take a quick break on the GSMC movie podcast, but be sure to stick around because in our fourth and final segment, I'm going to be taking a look at the month of April at the box office. I originally got interested in this topic because with theaters now opening up nationwide and movies having theatrical releases with the chance to actually make some box office, it got me wondering how the month of April normally fares when it comes to the box office. I did make a few surprising discoveries and did find out a lot about the type of films that are usually released in the month of April. So be sure to stick around as I'll be diving into all of that right here on the GSMC Movie Podcast. So don't go anywhere.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
The GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in my last segment, I just finished talking about Every Breath You Take, the new psychological thriller starring Casey Affleck and Michelle Monaghan. It tells the story of a psychiatrist who has a patient that commits suicide, and by trying to help her grieving brother, this psychiatrist's life is thrown into complete disarray. So if you are looking for a film that will take you on an incredibly emotional ride, I suggest you check out Every Breath You Take. It did make its debut April 2nd. It is available via video on demand and is being released in select theaters. So if you are a fan of the horror suspense thriller drama, be sure to check it out. But getting into our final topic of the day, with it being the start of April, I thought I would take a look at April at the box office and just get a sense of what this month traditionally means for the film industry. And to my surprise, I found out that it is traditionally the lowest grossing months at the box office. Other than October and September, April is the lowest grossing month of the year. And when taking a look at these monthly totals, I was not adjusting for inflation, but I'm fairly certain that the numbers would not look that different. And these totals I am working off of are from 1979 to the present, which is when comprehensive box office totals were accurately tracked and collected. And if anyone wants to do a deeper dive into these numbers, you can check them out at boxofficemojo.com. But surprisingly enough, the month of April is not one of the best for the American box office. And I'm sure there are a ton of factors for this. It may just be the fact that the weather's finally nice and that people would much rather be outside than making their way into a theater. But it is really hard to comprehend as to why there is this slight dip in the box office calendar just before the strongest stretch in the box office calendar. 4 of the top 6 months when it comes to total box office made, which of course is not surprising given that summer blockbusters rake in a whole ton of money. So with films of that nature often being released in the middle of May onward. So it is no surprise that the summer months of July, June, and August claim 3 out of the top 4 spots when it comes to monthly earnings at the box office, with December being the only reason that season does not have a clean sweep at the top 3 spots on the list. And given that December outpaces August by about $3 billion, I would say that the recent slew of Star Wars movies being released in December has something to do with that. And the month of May is only behind the month of January by about $200 million, which in any normal conversation would be a ridiculously large amount of money. But when it comes to the box office, it's all relative. And it will certainly be relative this year. If you would all indulge me for a second while I beat this dead horse again due to the COVID-19 pandemic and how little theaters have been able to rake in over this time, this month of April may actually have a chance to be one of the most profitable of the year. So good for you, April. And to give people an idea of how this April is faring so far, the top grossing movie is Tom and Jerry. But I'm sure once Godzilla vs. Kong and all the numbers from that have been raked in, things will change on that front. And despite that film came out on the very last day of March, most, if not all of its box office will be made during the month of April. And while I'm sure there are many factors that contribute to April being one of the lowest grossing months in the box office calendar, I do think it has been hamstrung by having some releases later in the month. For instance, the two biggest cinematic events in recent memory, the release of Avengers Infinity War, as well as Avengers Endgame. Both those films were released in April, but they were released on the 27th and 26th respectively. So while those films debuted in the month of April, they only had 3 and 4 days to make money during that month. Now, that didn't stop either of them from raking in $1 billion during the month of April, but still. When you have 2 of the top 5 grossing films of all time come out in April, but they're only allowed to make a certain amount in that month, that is going to contribute to a low total box office for the month of April, which does go a little bit in way of explaining why April is the 3rd lowest grossing month on the box office calendar. And when doing research for this segment, I thought that it would have something to do with the quality of films coming out, if they just didn't draw in audiences, they didn't have the blockbuster appeal, but that was obviously dispelled by the fact the last 2 Avengers films had been released in April, and just aside from those films. Additionally, during the month of April, 2 different installments to the wildly popular Fast and the Furious franchise have been released, as well as enjoying the opening run of a film like The Matrix, which, much like Godzilla vs. Kong, was released on the last day of March. So it's not as if studios are hesitant to release blockbuster films around April. Like I said, Godzilla vs. Kong was just released, and it's going to enjoy most of its box office run during the month of April. Later on in this month, the reboot of Mortal Kombat is going to be released, which studios are expecting a lot from. So it's not as if April has this reputation of being a black hole on the calendar where studios really hold back major movies from being released. And I even found an article from Forbes saying that April 2020 possibly could have been the best April at the box office ever, which would not have been surprising given that the 6 years prior to 2020, the month of April had made more box office than it had the previous year. And of course, having films like The Avengers come out during April certainly helped, but to give you an idea of what was slated to be released in April of 2020, A Quiet Place Part 2, which is still being delayed, Mulan, that was forced to be released via streaming on Disney+, and the much-anticipated 25th installment of the James Bond franchise, No Time to Die. So it's clear that studios have faith releasing giant blockbusters during the month of April, and maybe it's a thing where there isn't that much just all-round quality in the films being released, and a major one being in theaters at the time a bunch of less intriguing prospects being on the calendar is the reason for that. The logic there being, if there's one really great film out in theaters when a bunch of other mediocre films are out in theaters, audiences will just naturally gravitate to the bigger fish. And quite honestly, looking at the slate of movies to be released this April, I can understand that logic. I know we are living in unique times, and I, of course, am going to try to bring you the best of the best when it comes to new releases. But if those listening can just indulge me for a moment, a lot of these movies just look like crap. On my last episode, I talked about a film called French Exit starring Michelle Pfeiffer, and honestly, unless you're a huge fan of Michelle Pfeiffer, I don't understand what would be the purpose of seeing that film. She's a legendary actress, and anything she is in could be worth seeing solely for her involvement in it, but just from the clips I saw from this movie, it just looked like one of those films made to be pretentious for the sake of being pretentious. The major conflicts in the film really just seemed like they were major conflicts relative to a person who hasn't experienced much conflict in their life. And I'm sure there's some incredibly deep symbolism that I'm not picking up on. But how can a movie at the same time try to be a very emotional drama and at the same time have a frickin' character that is a talking cat? Now, in all fairness to French Exit, I have not seen the film, so it could be terrific. But just from the initial impressions I get on the film, it doesn't seem like something that would even interest me in the slightest. And I'm not the type of person that needs major explosions in everything I go see. I enjoy art house films, if you want to call them that. But a film based around characters that are rich people complaining about how they're no longer rich and all their ills are self-inflicted doesn't sound like it's a compelling film. And I get it's based off of a book. Sounds like an okay book. And I know that people are desperate for content and literally anything that has a pre-sold audience gets adapted nowadays. But if it's films like that are debuting in April and really only have a very niche audience, it isn't that surprising that April is the third lowest grossing month on the calendar. And I do apologize to my listeners if I'm seeming like a hypocrite for featuring a certain film on the podcast one week and then the next week completely turning around and saying it looks like the film equivalent of a colonoscopy. But really, my number one job on this podcast is to inform people of what's out there, and I don't want to be constantly trashing films, especially ones that I haven't seen. But I am human, I have limits. I will say, if you enjoy just character acting or are a fan of Michelle Pfeiffer in general, go ahead, see The French Exit, or a film of that ilk. But if you're looking to be truly entertained, it is not surprising that a bunch of people forego going to the cinema in the month of April. And when you think of it on a grander scale, I found a stat that 46% of people surveyed go to the movies less than once a year. So when it comes to that group of individuals, it's not surprising if they hold out for their one trip a year to the theater to be during the summer when a major blockbuster is out and they know they're at the very least going to see a major spectacle. And I do apologize to all movie lovers out there that prefer a film like French Exit over, let's say, a Marvel movie, and prefer to see a performance carried by the character acting by those participating in it. To them, I'll just say, if you really prefer that, go see a play. Well, I am not really sure what set off that tangent, but clearly I needed to get that off my chest. But we can return to the topic at hand, which is the month of April at the box office. And for those of you curious about the actual number I'm referring to here, it's around $19 billion. And again, that is not adjusted for inflation. If I were to do that, the raw total would be higher, but it wouldn't be making a difference when it comes to where it would be ranked on this list, because every other month would benefit the same amount from being adjusted for inflation. And again, these numbers come from the totals from the year 1979 to 2019, mainly because 1979 is when box office records were most accurately tracked, and I chose not to include the years 2020 or 2021 because that's just not going to give you an accurate depiction of what is typical for how individual months actually perform at the box office. Despite a month like January pretty much performing right in line with how it had in years past in 2020, that is really the only instance of that happening last year. But who knows, maybe with the pandemic and essentially this being a reset on the theater industry, new trends can emerge, and perhaps April could shake off the stigma of being one of the worst performing months at the box office and climb up into at least the top half of months performing. Again, studios are not shy about penciling in major blockbuster releases for the month of April, and one phrase that has been thrown around a lot during the pandemic is pent-up demand. Who knows how much pent-up demand there is for theatergoers. In other countries, where they have already loosened up the restrictions on theaters, people are turning out in droves to see the latest releases. And theaters in America are following suit when it comes to reopening. This week, the famous Chinese theater in Hollywood was reopened with all the bells and whistles, including a ribbon-cutting ceremony. And Regal Cinemas are planning to reopen hundreds of their locations in states like New York, Florida, California, Texas, Tennessee, Washington, Oklahoma, and Nevada. That, coinciding with the acceleration of the vaccines being rolled out, may contribute to a relatively big month at the box office this April. And in these closing moments of the show, I thought it would have been fun to give you some stats on biggest performers in the month of April, but pretty much all of them include Avengers Endgame to some degree. It is the highest film ever released in April, raking in over $427 million domestically, and might I remind you, that was a film that was released on the 26th, so it was essentially raking in $100 million a day during the month of April. And might I remind everybody, we're only talking domestically with those numbers. But despite its short run during the month of April, it did contribute to the most profitable April at the box office of all time. And that was the year of 2019. The second most profitable being the April of 2018, which, surprise, surprise, had Avengers Infinity War released during that time. And to date, those are the only 2 months of April that have grossed over $1 billion domestically. So despite the month of April being the third lowest grossing month on the box office calendar, hopefully things will change starting with this month as more and more theaters are beginning to open up. And hopefully due to a combination of a lot of people being vaccinated as well as pent-up demand, audiences will start returning to them. I really hope this is the case, and to anyone going to see a film in theaters, I do encourage you to be safe. But other than that, that'll pretty much do it for me on the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. I do want to thank everyone who is listening to the podcast. And if you have not already, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you're always notified when a new episode drops. If you could also write us a nice review, those really help us a lot. And be sure to follow us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Rich McDonough, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.